Hello, Dr. Kit Slice here, psychologist and life coach, here to inspire your confidence, self-compassion, and growth. And last week I talked about shame and really what that is, kind of defining it a little bit more. And just to kind of highlight that shame is that it's an experience where we're really kind of judging ourselves in some negative way about who we are deeply as a person, something along the lines of feeling like I'm not good enough or something like that. It's usually as a result of something that we've done or said, or it can even come from something that we just think about in our minds and are judging ourselves based on that. And so I wanted to go a little bit more into what do we do when we're feeling shame and what are the antidotes and how do we combat shame. Maybe combat isn't the right word because I think a loving approach is a more helpful one. So, in order to arrive at an antidote to shame, I think it's important to understand where shame comes from and like what the intention is behind shame. So, usually shame comes from a wound deep within. It may come from our childhood, some messaging that we got, whether it was direct or indirect from our caregivers or the people who were important to us in our lives, something about our personhood. Sometimes we're sent messages about how our behavior is wrong. And it's not like people are trying to shame us in that moment. It doesn't always happen as a malicious thing. Like sometimes here's an example. Sometimes you may be born with a certain personality characteristic. Personality characteristics are somewhat hereditary. Okay, so we're born in a particular way. We may be born, as an example, as somebody who's very outgoing and outspoken and wants to be moving all around and doing things and just has lots of energy. And maybe we're born into a family or a situation where it's valued to be more soft-spoken and not as outgoing and just to be a different way. And so I sort of sent these messages as a kid that who you are is not okay as a person. And it's not that those parents were meaning to send that message. It's just that that's the value system that they were living by. Um, so that child, as an example, may grow up to feel intense shame around behaviors of going out, going to parties or speaking up in group settings or something like that. They may feel shame when they're doing those things, even though that resonates deeply with who they are. So, and shame can come from other places too. It can come from trauma. We can feel intense guilt if we've been through a traumatic experience, even if we were the one who was victimized in that traumatic experience. A lot of folks can carry on guilt and shame as a result of that. So shame comes from different places, but the common thread is a place of woundedness, right? And so I think that that's important to keep in mind because the antidote to shame has to do with tending to our wounds. The other thing to keep in mind about shame is sort of like the intention behind it. So remember how we defined shame as sort of this experience of feeling like something about us as a person is not enough, not good, or whatever that is. So often the experience of shame, if we're really aware of ourselves when we're feeling shame, it might sound like, oh, I am not good enough, or I am not a good person in this moment, or I am bad, or something along those lines. But if you think about, if you deconstruct that a little bit, what are we really doing to ourselves in that moment? What are we really wanting for ourselves? What we're really wanting is to be good, to be a kind human or a good human or good enough. So if you think about the intention behind shame is it's a good intention. It's just that it comes out in a misguided way and it ends up making us feel sad, depressed, angry, or all sorts of emotions. So these are really important things to keep in mind when we're thinking about the antidote to shame, because if we can remember when we're feeling shame that, oh, I need to tend to my wounds, then we can do that with self-compassion. And we can also remember that maybe the intention of feeling shame is that we do want to be good. And how can we, in that moment when we've done something shameful, how can we connect with our goodness and still fulfill that intention? And what can be a helpful tool to sort of address both of those points is self-compassion. If you think about what compassion is really empathy plus a desire to relieve suffering. And it comes from a place of kindness or caring and love. Okay, so how can we be self-compassionate in the moment when we're feeling shame? The first part of that, remember, is the empathy piece. So that might look like just naming the shame, being aware of it, that it's happening in the first place, naming the shame first, and then acknowledging the pain. That's the empathy piece, because shame feels painful. It doesn't feel good to experience shame. And if we try to cover that up or glaze over it, we typically end up feeling more shame or other uncomfortable emotions as a result. So it is important to acknowledge that shame is painful. But we also don't want to live in that place of the pain. We're acknowledging the pain so that we can have compassion, which a complete cycle of compassion is the desire to relieve that pain that comes from a loving, kind place. So we've already done the empathy piece by acknowledging the shame, naming the shame, and then acknowledging the pain. The desire to relieve pain can come from something that you say to yourself in that moment. Because typically when we're feeling shame, we're going into that shame spiral. I'm a bad person, I'm not good enough, I'm horrible, and now I'm feeling sad and depressed, and I'm angry at myself. How could I have done that? Right? That's the shame spiral. What we're doing is reversing that spiral by acknowledging the shame and the pain, and then inserting some other kind of language to use with ourselves that is self-compassionate. I really love, I think I mentioned last time, something along the lines of, I am just trying in this moment to be kind to myself. That's a really great one. But I wanted to go into a little bit more about what you could use as self-talk that might meet that feeling of self-compassion for you. Some people like to say other things like, I am actually a good person, or I am trying to be a good person, or I know deep down that I am kind. I know deep down that I am patient. I know that I'm a gentle human being. I know that I am understanding. And these can be very helpful things, but I do want to put out there that sometimes these statements can backfire. Because if you are saying to yourself, oh yeah, I am a good person, but you're still really stuck in the shame spiral, what might end up happening is that you have sort of an argument with yourself about, what do you mean you're a good person? No, you're not. You just did this horrible thing. Like, where were you? We're in the shame spiral here, and you end up arguing with yourself about whether this thing is true. And so you can do some experiment with yourself. Can you say these positive things to yourself and believe them? And if so, wonderful. Then think about what would be helpful for you. Think about what your shame spiral tends to be around and what the true sort of opposite self-talk statement might be that's positive about who you are as a person. But if you struggle believing that in the moment, it's okay to make statements that you are trying to be that, or that you see that in yourself to some degree, and to hedge around it a little bit. Because remember, in that moment, the self-compassion, we're trying to show some love and tenderness in order to tend to our wounds. And so it can be gentle. It can be a gentle statement. And then as you make that self-compassion statement to yourself, you can also remind yourself that even though you're feeling shame, if you're still feeling it, that again, it comes from that place of wanting to be good or kind or patient or gentle or whatever the word is that fits for you. And that that's something that you want. So just to kind of summarize a little bit, it can be helpful to remember that shame comes from a place of woundedness, that the intention behind it might be a good one, though misguided, and that we can work with shame in the moment by naming the shame, acknowledging the pain, and then sending some love and kind words to ourselves that feel like they might fit. And it's okay if you have to practice with those words. It's okay if they don't fit perfectly, just so long as you're not getting into that argument with yourself. So I hope that this was helpful for you today to dive a little bit more into shame and how to work with it a little bit. Have a lovely week. Until next time. Bye.